Do you imagine traveling the world as an artist, going to those spots you've always dreamed of and making beautiful creations and gathering up inspiration? Well, today I'm going to share with you 7 tips for making this happen. I'm Aurora B, and I've lived in 10 countries and traveled to dozens of others making art. And I would like to share with you my tips for helping make travel and life as an artist possible. All 7 tips are tips that I have actually utilized in my career as a traveling artist. And this video was inspired by a recent 2-week trip that I took back to my home state of New York. Let's get right into these tips. The first option we have to becoming a traveling artist is to just take your current art practice on the road. So let's say you are an acrylic painter or an oil painter, you can just take your supplies with you. This first option is going to take a little extra planning because, of course, if you want to take liquid paints with you, for example, if you're an acrylic artist or an oil painter, you need to consider how you're going to transport those paints. And if you want to travel with carry-on only, unfortunately, you're going to be bound by those container limits. So you're probably going to need some checked luggage. And then once you get to that step of checked luggage, you're going to want to think about how you can keep those paints, especially oil paints, from bursting all over your clothes and your computer and anything else you might have with you. So if you want to take your paints with you, I would recommend making Tupperware your friend, putting the paints inside a Tupperware, but inside that Tupperware also bag them up. So triple bag everything to keep the rest of your luggage safe and to make sure that those paints are secured. You also want to think about your brushes. If you just throw them in with the rest of your luggage, they might get bent and even broken on the sides. So you want to think about some hard cases. And also you want to think about what you're going to be painting on. In terms of being a traveling artist, I might recommend something like painting on unstretched canvas or even painting on paper if that's an option for you. But remember, if you're painting on paper, you don't want to rip that paper on the way back home, so make sure you have some tubes to carry it with. On the other hand, if you want to use full canvases, that's fine. You might want to consider, however, purchasing those canvases when you land. And if you're only traveling for a short period of time, you will want to look into whether it's easier to ship them back to where your permanent location is, if you have one, or taking them back off the stretchers to transport them. You can roll them up, but it really depends on the medium you use. If you're like me and you like to use a lot of collage, sometimes taking that off the stretcher and rolling it up will be sort of a permanent process that will be really hard to undo. And finally, if you're going with this first option and you're just taking your regular practice on the road, assuming you're an acrylic painter, an oil painter, maybe even a watercolor painter, what I always also want to recommend to you is before you set out to travel on your next leg of your journey, to take really high quality photographs of your work in case they don't make it. And at least you'll have a record of that work. And if it's high quality enough, you might be able to still put it on print-on-demand sites or make some sort of use of it. The second option or tip to being a traveling artist is to take your regular art practice but make it smaller when you travel, or alter it a bit. So what I mean by this is that if you often use a sketchbook in your practice and then paint something, for example, maybe just take the sketchbook along, or consider making finished works in your sketchbooks, right? Nothing says your art has to be huge. So if you decide to be a traveling artist, especially if you're going to be a traveling artist full-time, you might really want to consider a smaller practice that you can complete in small sketchbooks or, for example, on small watercolor papers. The other option isn't necessarily about being smaller in size, but sort of being smaller in your amount of supplies, and that is doing digital art. So I'm assuming a lot of you that travel are already bringing an iPad or a computer with you, and these days you can make a lot of art right on those electronic devices. So you don't really need to bring any supplies with you at all. I know a lot of us that do Digital art still do some of that process manually, so you might want to still bring a sketchbook, some markers and pencils, some supplies in case you get in the mood to do some hands-on art, and then you can use your iPhone, for example, or other phone, or perhaps a small scanner, taking it with you, and then you can digitize that, and then you can work on the digital art even when you're on a train, when you're on a plane. This is a really great idea to be a traveling artist, is to scale down. My third tip for being a traveling artist is to use the time when you're traveling to do your marketing, to do your uploads, and to take some of those courses. This tip is especially for those who don't plan to be a full-time traveling artist, but are just going to travel for a few weeks, maybe months at a time, but have a home base. So during that time, assuming that you have some Wi-Fi connection, while you're traveling is a great time to work on your marketing content. For example, designing those Instagram posts, typing up some stories that you can share with your collectors. And if you're like me and you do some things like print on demand, you probably spend a lot of your time uploading to sites like Redbubble, Society6, Spoonflower. So if you have an internet connection while you're traveling, you can sneak in little increments and do some of your uploading and marketing. Even if you don't have the internet, you can just spend that time writing some of your content up, like stories you'd like to share with your art pieces. And especially while you're traveling, you'll probably get a lot of inspiration for more interesting stories that you can share with your audience and collectors. Also, if you're like me and you are an art course junkie, whether it be how to make art or how to do better marketing of your art, it's a really great time while you're traveling, if you have long flights, for example, to pop in a podcast and to soak in a lot of content. Maybe you have a journal with you or something you can at least type on, and you can take some notes and just spend that time concentrating on the marketing aspect of your art. My fourth tip for being a traveling artist is to get really creative with your materials. So say you've gotten somewhere and you forgot your art supplies, you hopped on a last minute train to Paris, or you took a flight to Djibouti and you didn't bring anything with you. Well, you can always find things around you on which to create art, right? You can collect receipts, you can collect newspapers. Especially when you're traveling, you can find so many cool things in different languages that use different color palettes and look really different than what you might find at home, and find them inspiring, right? So as a collage artist, I often love collecting materials, but also working directly on them. So I'm sure wherever you are, you can eventually find a pen or a pencil, and you can draw right on these raw materials that you find, and then later you can collage them into a finished piece. You can look into framing them in unique ways and displaying them as a finished piece of art. The fifth tip for being a traveling artist really ties into tip 4. And even if you decide you don't want to draw or paint or make art directly on the found materials, you can still collect materials on your travels and use them later in your art for collage type work. So even if you don't want to draw on that receipt or find a way to stitch while you're traveling onto a piece of fabric, you can collect used clothing where you are, receipts, books, and different things that you can use directly in your art by pasting it in later or stitching it in later to another finished piece. Tip 6 for being a traveling artist. When all else fails and you are traveling and you're enjoying yourself and you didn't bring your art supplies, or you did, but you're just in a different frame of mind because you're seeing the beautiful ancient ruins, or you're visiting friends and family, and you're not in that headspace, or maybe where you're staying isn't conducive to making art because you're sharing a room with too many people and you're jet lagged and you're tired. Well, you can always just gather inspiration, right? Half the reason we love being traveling artists is because of all the inspiration we find in the places where we go. So most of you, I assume, have a camera phone, and you can happily go around just taking pictures of things that inspire you. You can take pictures at local museums, ruins, fabric markets, anywhere. And I don't suggest, no cultural appropriation, no stealing things, but you can collect inspiration. And this is what I actually did on the recent trip that I took the last couple of weeks. It was the first time that I had traveled extensively with my 6-month-old daughter, and I had to carry with me a portable crib and a portable high chair and all kinds of other things. I barely had enough room for my clothes. We were also jet lagged and we were staying with family, so there wasn't a lot of time and space to be creating art, but I did take moments aside to purposely, intentionally go collect some inspiration for my art. And I was in upstate New York in the middle of October. This is such a beautiful fall season that we don't really get here in Southern California. When I returned, it was 94 degrees, even though it's the end of October. So I, took pictures of all kinds of fall leaves, other fall foliage, and just soaked in the inspiration walking around. So if you're traveling and you're an artist, this is something you can easily do, and you can tell yourself you are still doing your art. My last tip for being a traveling artist is sometimes you can take a trip and you can just take a break. But I recommend you be really intentional about it. A lot of us go traveling and we intend to make all kinds of interesting sketches in our sketchbooks, or we're gonna take our watercolors, and there are just those trips where it never happens. And if you're like me, sometimes you feel a little guilty about it. So I recommend sometimes, just like with any job or any career, you take a complete vacation. It's okay. Traveling will still recharge you and add to the depth of your art and your own personal perspective. If you've got some tips for being a traveling artist, please leave them in the comments below. I'm still learning too and would like to hear all about them. Also, if you've enjoyed this content, please subscribe. Hope to see you again next time, and until then, keep creating.